Good afternoon to all of you. Welcome to Frontiers in Environmental Economics and Policy, a symposium in honor of Marty Weitzman. I'm Rob Stavins, faculty member here at the Harvard Kennedy School and the director of the Harvard Environmental Economics program, which is hosting this event together with two other entities, the Harvard University Center for the Environment and the Mossavar-Rahmani Center for Business and Government at the Kennedy School. Having learned so much from Marty over the 26 years we've been co-hosting the seminar in Environmental Economics and Policy, I'm delighted to have actually the privilege to moderate this afternoon's festivities. From our earliest planning of this event, including many people in the room and all of our panelists, everyone was thrilled to participate because Marty has made such important contributions to what was, at the beginning of our relationship, the emerging area, and now I think it's fair to say, the mature area of the global scholarship on environmental economics. And he's had a huge part of that. We have a very full agenda, as you've probably seen, including starting out with a keynote address by Bill Nordhaus. Following that, we have a panel discussion with 7 leading authorities in environmental economics, each of which have made very important contributions of their own to the study, and they're going to be commenting on different aspects of Marty's own contributions. And then, after a response from Marty Weitzman, we'll take questions from the floor. As you can see, there are a couple of microphones, but I'll give you plenty of time, plenty of warning of when you might want to move to a microphone to pose a question. I wanted to mention that the event is being video recorded. It's also being transmitted simultaneously into an adjoining room, because obviously we've filled this room, so people that have been arriving for the last 10 minutes are watching on video and hopefully hearing as well on speakers next door. A link to the video, in case you want access to it, is going to be posted on the website of the Harvard Environmental Economics program probably within a few days. And then following the symposium at about 5:30 p.m. at the latest, we'll finish by then, you're all invited to a reception which is going to take place immediately behind me, just outside these doors in this long corridor. You won't have to pile up and line up behind one bar. We're going to have several that are set up. For those of you who would like something to drink. So with that, let me just turn to the opportunity to introduce our keynote speaker, Professor William Nordhaus of Yale University. There's this cliche that I often refer to, that our speaker needs no introduction. This time it's really true. So I'm going to give what is a very brief one compared with what is merited, even if you took a cursory look at his CV and his list of important contributions and accomplishments. For nearly 4 decades, Bill Nordhaus has written about the economics of the environment, which is remarkable. I mean, 4 decades, there are a number of people here, almost all the students, who weren't alive 4 decades ago, but he was already writing about it then. He built on his background as a macroeconomist, focused on economic growth, to begin to recognize the importance of energy generation and energy use in a modern economy, and that led him into doing work on energy very early in his career, in the 1970s, shortly after he began his academic career at Yale, and then began working in the early 1980s on global climate change economics, long before most other economists were even aware of the problem, let alone actually analyzed it. He's been on the faculty of Yale University since 1967, where he is now, of course, the Sterling Professor of Economics. I understand from those who have taken classes with him that you could also make it a small s and say he is a Sterling Professor of Economics. He's also a professor in Yale School of Forestry and Environmental Studies. Member of the National Academy of Sciences, Fellow of the American Academy of Arts and Sciences, Distinguished Fellow of the American Economic Association, and of course a Research Associate of the National Bureau of Economic Research. In addition to his many scholarly achievements, the youngest among you may not recognize that he was a member of the President's Council of Economic Advisors in the Carter administration. And what's particularly striking about Bill Nordhaus's contribution in this sphere is that, as long as I can remember anyway, he has made his path-breaking dice model freely available both for access and use by other scholars all around the world. And there's a whole literature of others who have then used that model and made modifications to it. So finally, I need not tell you that earlier this week he was named a recipient of the Nobel Prize in Economics. So please join me in welcoming Bill Nordhaus. Did you throw the...
Well, it's a wonderful occasion to gather here, and with such a distinguished crowd, to focus on such an important event, an afternoon on one single topic, to celebrate the career life of our friend and colleague Marty Weitzman, a great economist who is at one of our top universities. So if you listen closely, you'll hear the footsteps. And that's what I want to talk about today. I want to talk about the intellectual footsteps of Marty across the landscape of economics, and particularly environmental economics. I want to talk about how his work has changed the way we think about economics and the environment. So Marty and I go back to 1964, shortly after I graduated from college, and when we arrived together at the iconic MIT economics department. And that was heaven, I just have to say. If there are any graduate students here, you are living in heaven. It will never be so nice. There was nothing to do but listen to brilliant economists, and then eventually just scribble a few things so you could get a degree. We then went to Yale together in 1967 and had a wonderful time. Actually, being a junior faculty member is next to being a graduate student a great thing. But then Marty migrated back here, downstream a little bit, to MIT, and then upstream here to Harvard. You all know that. And you know of his many distinctions and honors, and if you don't know about them, you can read about them. But what you may not appreciate, those of you who are not deep in this field, is his profound influence across economics. Now, not just environmental economics, but work outside. He did a path-breaking series of studies on the share economy, which is different from what you could call the wage economy. Maybe we're moving to the share economy. Some of our sectors work in the share economy. He did work on Russia, what was then called the Soviet Union, and central planning. And those of you who like really geeky things, he did duality theory for infinite horizon convex models, all kinds of things. But what I want to do today is concentrate on his work in environmental economics and his many, many contributions there. So I'll mention a half a dozen, each of which are path-breaking. One of his most important was prices versus quantities in regulation, which has really shaped the way economists and some regulators think about the subject. He's written about discounting in an uncertain world, which has just opened my eyes and other people's eyes to the role of uncertainty. I don't know how many of you know his path-breaking work on measuring biodiversity. It's something, what can I say? We need an economist to tell us how to measure biodiversity. But if you actually look at this literature, and maybe I'm sure some of you have, not everybody, it's a very confused literature, but I think Marty worked in that, I don't know, probably a month or so, but he really, I think made the most profound contribution to how to think about it. And then another one is one of my favorite papers, which is his work on fat tails, series of papers, his work on fat tails and the dismal theorem. And I'll just pause here for a minute. It's not the main thing I want to talk about, but it's both his most difficult paper and in a way his most interesting paper. But what it does is it reflects, Marty, before he came into economics, worked in statistics, got an MA in statistics, and this reflects the combination of his thinking and his background in statistics as well as his background in economics. So the main proposition is this: under certain circumstances, A plus B equals infinity. Now, the dismal theorem says under those conditions, you can't do, and those are conditions which are fat tails plus some other things. I'll talk about that, and for those of you who are not familiar with this, I'll talk about it. But under certain conditions, you cannot, these fat tails plus some other things, you cannot do the standard cost-benefit analysis that economists love to do. Now, this was a big hit. It was particularly a big hit among those who don't like cost-benefit analysis, which is about half of the environmental community. Now, I have to say, I struggled with this paper for many, many months to try to understand it. I was like the little boy, I can't remember the fairy tale, but he goes around and he asks everybody he meets about the key to the universe or the key to happiness. I can't remember what it was. And so I went around, everywhere I went, I would, if it had been here, I would have said, somebody, can you explain this paper to me? No, I'm sorry. No, first we'd talk about the paper, and they would say, great paper, really love the paper. And so I would say, can you explain it to me, how it works? And they would say, well, actually, I haven't read it. Or I'm a little foggy on the details, or the technical parts, or ask Tom, or Jane, I'm sure they understand it. So like the little boy, I kept asking, do you understand this paper? Do you understand the dismal theorem? And I never understood anyone but Marty who actually understood it. So unlike the little boy, I didn't reach wisdom. Now, it's, as I said, it's his most loved but also least understood paper. So what's the point of it? The point of it is there are these so you all know the bell-shaped distribution, which is really nice. But there are also very strange distributions that have what are called fat tails. And what that means is that there are the events that you would think would be unlikely, almost infinitely unlikely, actually occur. These are distributions I learned about. Actually, I don't, Marty, if you remember, that Paul Samuelson wrote about this in an early paper that I remember reading, and I was just like blown away by, on these are called Pareto-Levy distributions, technically. And they were just coming in, just so when we were graduate students, they'd been discovered earlier, but they were just being imported into economics. One of the earliest uses was by Mandelbrot, who actually found that stock prices and other prices followed this very strange distribution. And the basic idea is that with these distributions, you'll get events that shouldn't occur with the normal distribution, either ever or maybe in the life of an infinity, a universe of universes. And the problem is when you have these, every once in a while you have these rare events that shouldn't occur. So I'll give an example. Let me just put this back on here. I'll give you an example. So heights of people are roughly normally distributed. So an example of this distribution is if you would look over there and see a 23-foot, not Ken Galbraith, who was a colleague of some people here, you may remember, a very tall man, 7 feet roughly. He loved his height because he said he could see de Gaulle across the room. But anyway, but if a 23-foot person walked in here, you would be very, very surprised. But that's the kind of thing that happens with these distributions that Marty wrote about. One of the interesting points about these distributions is that our standard analysis of portfolio theory, which uses mean variance theory, just doesn't apply because the variances are infinite for these distributions. And there are other examples as well. Marty, I would say this is the only thing I'm going to say that's not 100% positive. Marty picked the case of climate sensitivity, and that's when this is one place where we part ways. I don't think it applies there, but it does apply in some other areas. And one of the most interesting is earthquakes, that the size of earthquakes appears to be following these strange distributions. Okay, so enough on that. That's a really interesting area. It's well, it's interesting that, for example, earthquakes, I don't think it's seeped into the analysis of the impacts of earthquakes, that if these are really these strange distributions, what policy should be. So the final paper I want to talk about is on ideal measures of national income. And this was another revolutionary paper, changed the way about how we think about the way we measure the size of our economy. Now, basically, this series of papers, it started out with a very technical paper and then also was applied to the environment, is a way to think about how we include externalities like pollution, climate change, if you like, or greenhouse gas emissions into our measurement of output, into our national accounting framework. It's popularly called green GDP. That's okay. That kind of captures what it means. Okay, so I remember the exact moment when I became interested in green GDP. I was flying across the country, sitting on the flight of TWA, which will date this. For those of you who don't remember Trans-World Airline, it is long defunct. And I was reading an article on criticizing our gross national product. And I remember exactly what it said. It was quoted, this is what it said, the author. In the words of the young radical, don't tell me about your GNP. To me, it's really gross national pollution. So I thought, wow, that is really cute. But is it true? Actually, it's completely false. Our output measures do not include pollution. They include goods like cars and services like concerts or education, but they do not include CO2 that's pumped into the atmosphere. But it does reflect a subtle and correct point, which is that the measures that we use in our national accounts do not properly account for these spillovers. They didn't in 1970 when I read this, and they still don't today. So let's just spend a minute on this. So spillovers are, I think, increasingly important in our densely packed, globalized economy. And they're important. If we look at, for example, the death from particulate matter in the atmosphere in the United States, it's roughly 35,000 people in the latest calculation per year. So it's important. I mean, this is just one example of the important. But this is not included. There's no measure of that in our national accounts. Now, we've also taken aside from this part that's not included, we also take steps to reduce pollution abatement. And a rough guess is that it's about 2% of output today. And that is included, and that's included in our national accounts as a debit, something that we spend that essentially we don't get anything from. It's just like poured down the drain. Now, opponents of regulation say these are wasteful, they slow economic growth. And the interesting thing is if you want to maximize GNP or GDP, they're right. You should just rip it out of the rule books because it doesn't do anything. It just costs and there's no benefit to these regulations. So just rip it out. I mean, maybe, if I won't say anything about the current political scene, but maybe this is the theory, maximize GDP. And in a narrow arithmetic sense, it's right. But the reason it would be right that these regulations slow growth is because we're using the wrong yardstick. It's the incorrect yardstick. And they include, because our yardstick, our measure of national output, includes the costs but leaves out the benefits. I'm not to Marty yet, almost there. So as an example, if there's a regulation that costs $1 billion and has benefits of $2 billion, GDP goes down $1 billion, but obviously the real measure should go up $1 billion. And this example shows how our yardstick is flawed. Okay, so I remember after I read that article about the young radical, I tried to think how we're going to fix it, and we tried to do some fixing, but it was a very flawed attempt to fix it because we didn't know how to do it. How were we supposed to include these externalities in our accounting? And the literature on this is very confused and wrong-headed. But there was one person who was right-headed on this, and that was where Marty enters the scene with his paper on measuring national output, and then the one that is most closely connected with this point, which is 2002, called Sustainability and Technical Progress. So here's the idea. When you want to measure output, you want to subtract depreciation. So if you have a hurricane and the houses are destroyed, you don't want to count that as output, the replacement of that as output. You want to subtract depreciation. So the idea of this paper is you want to also subtract the depletion of environmental assets along with the depreciation of physical assets. And that sounds pretty straightforward, but it's actually not that straightforward, and it wasn't really clear at that time. So to get this green GDP measure, what you need to do is you need to subtract damages, and those are damages when measured at the appropriate marginal damages price. And that's how you would create green GDP. So let's talk about how we do that. So currently we include in our output measures apples and bananas and zithers, but we don't include pollution, and we should. But the problem is, the insight is we should subtract pollution from our measure of output. And if we adopt the Weitzman approach, what we do is we take the apples and the bananas and the zithers, which we add up, and then we subtract the depreciation of our environmental assets just the way we subtract the depreciation of our standard assets. To do that, we price externalities, and then we add, that's to say subtract, we add the negative of the depletion from our measure. Now, the only tricky thing here is to remember that pollution are bads rather than goods, and therefore have a negative price. All this is pretty straightforward, except you might wonder, well, what is this price of pollution? Perhaps sulfur dioxide, perhaps carbon dioxide. And again, as I mentioned before, it's the marginal damage or the social cost of pollution, the social cost of carbon that would be subtracted. The social cost of carbon is actually This is a technical term that's used now to measure the damage from an extra ton of CO2 in the atmosphere. It's a very complicated and difficult calculation, but that's the concept that you would use to implement this. So the problem is solved. We just have to calculate green output. We take the standard stuff and we subtract the quantity of pollution times its price. Problem solved. Now, we actually have extensive data on pollution of almost all emissions over pretty long periods of time. But in most cases, and actually I would say in all cases, we do not have agreed upon values of the prices or the marginal damages. And interestingly, as a result of this, there's not a single government in the world that has created a reasonably complete set of green GDP accounts. They've thought about it, they've argued about it, some have started and stopped, some have said it's not possible, but at this point, no government has yet done that. But let's just think of how you would do it if you did it. So this is the way you do it. And I'll just take one example that's pretty straightforward. Let's take the case of climate change and greenhouse gases. It's so simple. If you like to do this, you can just go back. If you have a quiet moment tonight, after a couple of glasses of wine, even you can do it with a spreadsheet. It's so simple. So what you do is you take emissions, you take the social cost of carbon, you multiply them together, and you subtract that from GDP, net domestic product or net national product. So you begin with emissions, and you can go to the EPA website. You can go almost anywhere for that. Then for the price, you can go, if it's still up, I don't know if it's still up, but if it's not, you can ask Michael Greenstone, he'll give it to you. The estimate of the social cost of carbon, estimated by the US government and used by the US government in regulations that are billions of dollars of benefits. And then you subtract those. Now, when you do that, you're going to get two effects. One is you're going to get a level effect, and you're going to get a growth effect. So the level effect is you'll subtract something, and so green output will be lower than standard output. Okay. And in this case, maybe a couple of percent for, if you do the numbers for carbon dioxide, it's a couple percent lower. But what's surprising when you do this is the growth effect. Because while the level effect is negative, it actually increases in the last 2 or 3 decades economic growth. Because the amount you're subtracting has declined over time. Emissions of CO2 have declined, or if we go to other things like sulfur dioxide, those have declined. So at a given price, the share of those in GDP will decline. So you can do this. I won't. I've done these back of the envelope calculations, what I'll call kind of in the spirit of Weitzmanomics, back of the envelope, but usually back of the envelope. I learned in graduate school back of the envelope is like 90% of what you get in doing 10 years work. So let's do rough and ready Weitzmanomics estimates. Do it for CO2, do it for SO2, do it for other particulates. And here's a very, very rough estimate. The level effect is in the order, for the last 20 years, is in the order of 10% of GDP, or net product. It's pretty big because these have been very costly. But almost all of these pollutants have been declining over time. And so the growth effect is substantially positive. And I would guess, well not guess, I would say these rough and ready estimates are in the order of 0.5% per year. So if you ask what's happened to true output over the periods from, say, 1990, 1995 to the latest data, real output has probably grown about 0.5 percentage point faster than measured output. So substantially more. So this just scratches the surface, and it's an example of how an idea such as the one that Marty presented in this is so powerful. It's too powerful. It's so powerful that governments can't contemplate it and deal with it. But at some point, like many ideas, it will be able to come. It will be implemented. So let me just say something about the interpretation here. Why did this happen? And it's actually quite interesting. If we go back half a century with these externalities such as air pollution, these are ones where this was a low-hanging, inexpensive fruit. So with small and relatively inexpensive regulations and investments, we could have substantial improvements in our health and welfare. And this was actually, I see Dick Schmolensee here, who was the head of a study which did an early investigation and showed that for air pollution regulation, but I think this is true of other ones. So we were picking the low-hanging fruit, reducing health and other damages substantially at very low costs. So when we include those, the negative of those, the damages were being reduced relatively inexpensively, we're going to get a big increase in our growth rate. But we would miss those with our standard accounts. When we extend them to the augmented accounts, as you might call them, then the environmental policies have had a substantial impact on our genuine economic growth. I might add just one further elaboration, which is another deficiency of the way we measure things, is we don't include health. It's not widely recognized that our conventional measures of national income and output include any valuation of the improved health status of the population. So if our incomes stay the same, but we're healthier, and we live a year longer or 10 years longer, that will not show up in the way we measure things. But we can apply these Weitzman techniques to value improvements in health and life expectancy as well. And I did another back of the envelope on this, and it looked as if the value of health improvements were very substantial. In fact, in the early part of the 20th century, maybe as important as other non-health or non-medical improvements put together. I might say this, I don't know if David Cutler is here today. If he's not here today, he's in the neighborhood. But this built on some very important work that he did on the economics of health. So, if the young radical were come back today as an old radical, I think his attitude to national accounts, and he listened and he studied and he sat at the feet of Martin Weitzman and he listened about the architecture of national accounts with Dale Jorgensen, but he would come back with a different attitude. And he would say to me, Bill, I don't think what I said is right. Would you write what I should say today? And this is what he would say. Those who claim that environmental regulations hurt growth are completely wrong because they're using the wrong yardstick. Pollution should be in our measures of national output, but it should enter with a negative sign. And if we use green national output as our standard, then environmental and safety regulations have increased true economic growth substantially in recent years. And he would end with this: for this important insight, we applaud Martin Weitzman, a radically innovative spirit in economics.
So thank you very much, Bill, for a wonderful, wonderful presentation. At this point, I want to invite our panelists to come up and join me in their portioned chairs, and we'll move into the next part of our program. Yes, Bill, you're going to stay up here with us. You'll notice there's one empty chair next to me, and that's because after we've heard from the panelists, then Marty Weitzman is going to join us up here to respond to what he's heard. So we've assembled what I mentioned before, which is a really distinguished set of panelists that really span a tremendous amount of scholarship in environmental economics and beyond that. And what we wanted to do was to have each panelist comment on, or at least start from, one area of Marty Weitzman's contributions to environmental economics. But you can see we couldn't fit a panel large enough to cover all of the areas. So, but we are going to cover what we consider to be some of the really important ones, which actually complement nicely Bill Nordhaus's focus so much on green accounting. Now, each of these panelists in and of themselves have made very important contributions to environmental economics. If they were visiting Harvard on their own for a seminar or a speech or anything else, I would take a lot of time to give each of them the introduction that they deserve, as I have actually done in a number of cases with this group in the past. But given the size of the panel and our allotted time, I hope that you all will understand and they will understand that I'm going to forego extended introductions and just be very brief as I turn to each of the panelists, because that would just take too much time from their own commentaries. So I'm going to begin with Richard Newell, who is president of Resources for the Future, and I should mention a former student of Marty Weitzman's when he was at Harvard. Richard, I'd ask you to start us off by reflecting on Marty's seminal work in 1974, Prices versus Quantities.
Thanks, Rob. And it's really an honor to be doing this, having Marty been on my dissertation committee. I was a TA for Marty and have appreciated and built upon his work for many, many years. I want to start by placing this work in the context in which it was written in 1974. And there's really two major thrusts, I think, that lay behind this paper in terms of interest of Marty's. And the first was Marty's writing up into that point, which focused principally on comparing economic systems, particularly the planned economy of the Soviet Union and the market economies of the West. And for example, Marty at that point had published a couple papers I'll just reference. One was Iterative Multi-Level Planning with Production Targets in Econometrica, and the other was Soviet Post-War Economic Growth and Capital Labor Substitution in the American Economic Review. So Leonid Brezhnev was in the middle of his leadership of the USSR, a period that he referred to as developed socialism. Later on, Mikhail Gorbachev would have referred to this as the beginning of the era of stagnation in the Soviet Union. So I can't say it. Marty's an incredible writer and clear thinker, so I can't do better than to just read his introduction to the paper. The setting up for the problem under consideration is a large economic organization or system, which in some cases is best thought of as an entire economy. Within this large economic organization, resources are allocated by some combination of commands and prices. The following question arises: what is the best way to implement control for the benefit of the organization as a whole? Is it better to directly administer the activity under scrutiny or to fix transfer prices and rely on profit maximization or utility maximization to achieve the same ends in a decentralized fashion? This issue is taken as the prototype problem of central control, which is studied in the present paper. There's a great many specific examples which fit nicely into such a framework. And it's then that Marty reveals the second major emerging issue of relevance at the time, which is the environment. He states, one current interest is the question of whether it would be better to control certain forms of pollution by setting emission standards or by charging the appropriate pollution taxes. So this was a period in 1974. The Clean Air Act Amendment and the Clean Water Act had been passed in 1970 and 1972. The Safe Drinking Water Act was passed and signed into law in 1974. And this was, I think, probably Marty's first environmental paper, if I got it right. Maybe it had snuck in there somewhere before. But this was a period that would, for 5 decades, emerge again and again in Marty's writing after that time. As Rob alluded, I started at Harvard doing my PhD in 1992, and this was actually the year in which Marty published in the Quarterly Journal of Economics a paper called On Diversity, which actually ended up being the beginning of a second major phase of Marty's work and contributions to environmental economics, which continues to this day. So in further setting the stage for the paper, Marty makes it clear that predispositions toward one or another of these two instruments is actually not well-founded in economic theory. He does this in kind of classic Marty style. He then disarms you and makes you kind of opens up your mind and makes you think about the problem, whereas you might have thought you already knew the answer. He says, now a basic theme of resource allocation theory emphasizes the close connection between these two modes of control. No matter how one type of planning instrument is fixed, there's always a corresponding way to set the other one, which achieves the same result when implemented. From a strictly theoretical point of view, there's really nothing to recommend one mode of control over another. This notwithstanding, I think there is a fair generalization to say that the average economist in the Western marginalist tradition has at least a vague preference toward indirect control by prices. Just as the typical non-economist leans toward the direct regulation of quantities. And actually a hallway conversation with Bill Hogan to me earlier today revealed that he's in the Western marginalist tradition very clearly. Marty goes on, if there was really some basic intrinsic advantage to a system which employed prices as planning instruments, we would expect to observe many organizations operating with this mode of control, especially among multi-divisional business firms in a competitive environment. He then goes on to show that that simply isn't the case. And so again, making you step back and think again about what predispositions you might have. He then sets up the model in classic Weitzman style. There's just the right amount of structure and complexity and absolutely no more than that. There's a marginal benefit or demand function. There's a marginal cost or supply function which has uncertainty in it, which ends up being a central element of where these different instruments diverge. The planner sets the policy, which is either a fixed price or a fixed target of quantity target. And then given its actual costs, the firms then react to the policy. That's it. That's the whole structure. As in much of Marty's work, uncertainty plays a really critical role in the outcome. So then comes the good part. And one of the most important things that I learned from Marty Weitzman is that a good model talks back to you. You learn something from results that you didn't know in advance. It's more than just a simple regurgitation of the assumptions that you put into the model. And this model absolutely talks back to you. So the basic results of this, the prices versus quantity frameworks, what it revealed to us is that the preferred policy instrument depends upon the relative steepness of the marginal benefit and the marginal cost function, with a relatively steep marginal benefit function indicating a preference for a quantity instrument, targeting quantities, whereas a relatively steep marginal cost function or flat marginal benefit function points you toward a price instrument. In the environmental consequence, the intuition is pretty straightforward once you know it, which is that for an environmental problem that has like serious threshold effects where you'll majorly mess up if you have just a little bit more of the pollutant, this is something that's indicative of a very steep marginal benefit function where you should use some strict quantity limits. On the other hand, if you have a pollution situation where the first unit of pollution is about the same damage as the millionth unit of pollution, this is something that would tend to call for a price instrument. So over years, there's been actually over 1,000 articles. This is Marty's most highly cited paper that have referred back to this. The key ingredients of these different papers continues to be very similar to this day. It depends on the structure of the uncertainty in the problem. It depends upon the complexity and design of the policy instrument. And it also depends upon when firms and when policymakers and planners can react to new information as it's revealed. Those consistent ingredients which showed up in this first paper continue to show up in all of the subsequent papers to this day. So thank you, Marty, for a gift that keeps on giving.
Yeah, before we turn to Charlie, I'll say that this is actually a great example of learning at Marty's feet, because in the paper Prices versus Quantity, Marty has a footnote, and I think it's the second or third page, that says you're assuming statistical independence between benefits and costs. I subsequently, maybe 20 years, 30 years later, wrote a paper in which I dropped that assumption, published that work, validating, in the case of a footnote, that I've learned at your feet. So I'm going to turn to Charlie Kolstad next, because as we've heard, that in fact, actually before Marty began to work on climate change economics and policy, which current generation I'm sure associates him with to such a large degree, he had actually done some very, very important work in examining biodiversity from an economic perspective. And as Bill Nordhaus has said, made more sense in terms of being able to rank one ecological community compared to another than ecologists had been able to do. So, Charlie, tell us about it.
So I'm going to talk about the, biodiversity. Let me first say, though, I don't hear an echo, but I guess it's fine. Let me first say it's a real honor to be here with Marty and with the rest of you, let alone up here at the bar, in our bar stools. There's also a connection that Marty and I have. Back when he graduated from college, he and all the other flower children of the country migrated to California, and he happened to get a master's in statistics at that time. But who knows what else went on in that period of time. So he got his master's at Stanford, which is the other connection. He, as we have learned, contributed to many fields, and I'm going to focus on biodiversity, which appears to be roughly the 1990s in Marty's publishing career. As with most of his work, he develops a very elegant theory with strong empirical implications, and he writes very well. So I think that characterizes many of his papers. In environmental economics, as we all know, there are two terms that always pop up. One is sustainability, and the other is biodiversity. And I think both of them share the concept that it seems really important, but nobody's quite sure exactly what it means. And people have tried to put some meat on those bones. Now, sustainability, we have a number of papers addressing that. Bob Solow did some seminal work on that in the 70s and beyond. But in biodiversity, this is what Marty tackled in his work in the 1990s. To quote from one of his early papers, often there is an implicit injunction to preserve diversity because it represents a higher value than other things. Yet the laws of economics apply to diversity also. We cannot preserve everything. His approach to diversity was to go back to first principles, to undertake an axiomatic development of what we mean when we are talking about diversity. Try to put some specificity, things that people can agree or disagree on. And much as Arrow's social choice contributions, which were pure theory, that theory had enormous empirical implications, and the same with Marty's diversity work. His two major papers on diversity and the Noah's Ark problem are motivated by the simple observation that if we want to preserve things to enhance biodiversity, we should know how to measure it. Very sensible. And that's tougher than you think. So his view of diversity is that we care about preserving genetic material as well as the unique characteristics of a species. So if you think of a rat and an elephant, they may have the same amount of DNA. Actually, I don't know if they have the same amount of DNA, but there's direct utility from those two things that probably differs. And so both the DNA diversity as well as the value of the species were considered important. His goal is developing a characteristics of diversity function that can appeal to biologists as well as economists, and that's quite a challenge. And I should know more about how the biologists reacted to it. Maybe that's you can enlighten me at another time. Now, in the Noah's Ark problem, he took a step towards addressing an age-old, in fact, one of the first environmental planners, Noah, of how he should fill up his ark. One of the lines that I loved in that paper was a classic Marty line says, "Noah is a practical outdoors man. He needs a simple choice heuristic to decide whether to let a pair of animals, or I guess animals, onto the ark." And went through and developed at a theoretical level, this econometric paper, the conclusion that Noah could rank the species. This is sort of an optimization problem for Noah to maximize diversity, subject to the size of the ark. Fortunately, the size of the arc was not a variable in your paper. That would have made it a much more complicated problem. But he concluded that it's a simple optimization problem. All you need to know is the marginal diversity of a species, what they contribute at the margin to diversity, the direct utility of the species, and the marginal cost of increasing the survivability of the species. In Noah's case, it was cubits, which is some multiple of a cubic foot in his arc. This was his cost. And then he goes on to illustrate both of these papers in empirical, semi-empirical applications. First on hooping cranes, cranes generally, trying to look at how would you maximize diversity. And one of the conclusions that's striking is that you wouldn't focus on the crane has the highest probability of becoming extinct, which is the hooping crane. But the choices would be much more complex, and in fact, you would focus on a much more common crane because it happens to be genetically further afield from its neighbors. And a somewhat different empirical applications is work with Andrew Metrick, in which he tries to infer the Fish and Wildlife Service's objective, sort of a revealed preference applied to a management agency, to see if, in fact, they care at all about diversity or what they do care about. And one of the striking things he found was to reinforce this notion that it's the size of the critter that makes the difference. It's tempting to close by using diversity theory and evaluating the uniqueness of Marty's CV. There's so much intellectual diversity in there. But in this case, diversity is not sufficient. The intellectual DNA in the CV is central to many researchers and research. Truly a career of significance and importance.
You know, talk about influencing other young scholars. I could just picture the PhD students in the room deciding to adopt as an additional control variable in the Noah's Ark problem the size of the ark. There you go, there's a dissertation. So next we're going to hear from Larry Goulder, a longtime professor at the economics department at Stanford University, and also formerly a colleague of Marty's in the economics department at Harvard. Larry, as you well know, when analyzing a long-term problem such as global climate change, the discount rate can not only be important, but dominant sometimes in an analysis.
Is that so, really?
Yeah. So would you tell us about that and about Marty's contributions thereof?
I just want to say what a pleasure it is to be here. I've not only benefited over the years from your brilliance, Marty, but also getting to know you, your breadth, your warmth. What a pleasure. And it's just great. Yes, I agree, Rob. One very important decision that policymakers have to make is to, or at least what they have to calculate is, how are the benefits from a long-term investment? How can you translate them to equivalent dollars today? And the choice of the discount rate is critical there. A lot rides on this choice because very small differences in your chosen discount rate can make a huge difference in what you take as the present value of the benefits. So you might want to say, well, let's base the discount rate choice on market interest rates. But the problem there is there's a lot of uncertainty about what market interest rates will be in the future, about what will be the opportunity cost of funds used for the investment. How do you address it? Suppose, for example, to take a very simple example, suppose there's a 50% chance that from here on, the market interest rate will be 1%. And an equal chance that from here on, the market interest rate will be 7%. You might say, well, if there's an equal chance of each, let's just take the average of the two and let's use a 4% discount rate. Well, in a very important paper in 1998 in the Journal of Environmental Economics and Management, and then in subsequent papers, Marty says that's wrong. You can't just take an average. And perhaps more importantly, he says the rate you choose should depend on the time horizon involved, how far into the future the project extends. So, for example, in this very simple setting that I just said, described with a 1% or a 7% discount market rate of equal probability, if the horizon's about 2 years, then you should use about a 4% rate for your discount rate. If the horizon's 100 years, you should use a rate closer to 1.5%. And that makes a huge difference. It means, for example, that if we were using a simpler approach where we just averaged our expectations, we'd be using a discount rate that's much too high if it's a long-term project. In the context of climate change, we'd be underinvesting in efforts to provide the infrastructure, to provide the mitigation. It could make a big difference. For example, the difference between using a 4% discount rate for a 100-year horizon project for climate change versus a 1.5% discount rate is a factor of 12 in terms of the present value of the benefits. It makes a huge difference in terms of abatement. We owe it to Marty to have really brought to life this notion that the time horizon matters, and the longer the time horizon, other things equal, the lower the discount rate one should use. Now, the example I just used was very simple, but Marty has shown, as well as some work by Richard Newell, Billy Pizer, and others, that it also applies in more complex setting where you have varying discount rates over time. Now, the approach I just mentioned was based on, say, let's choose a discount rate based on the opportunity cost of capital as evidenced to some degree by the market interest rate. There's a whole different approach that also is used sometimes to calculate the value of investments or how much we should invest, which is kind of called the Ramsey approach. It's basically the approach that a social planner would use if he or she is trying to maximize net value based on this investment. It's a different approach which takes into account marginal utility, elasticity of marginal utility of consumption, growth rate of the economy, whether shocks in consumption are correlated over time. Marty, in subsequent work, has also examined this in this alternative setting using the Ramsey approach, an extended Ramsey approach with uncertainty, and has shown that in many cases, the same general result applies, at least in general form, namely that you want declining interest rates depending on the time horizon. So it's a robust result. Marty has also worked closely with Christian Gaulier, who's here today, who's been a very leading advocate of, or a developer of the Ramsey approach. And it's nice to see that the two of them together have found ways to reconcile what previously were seen as differences in conclusions across the results. So, in sum, I would say there's a key contribution here that could be summarized as follows. That for long-term investments, the longer term the investment, the lower the appropriate discount rate, other things equal. It's not always the case that other things will be equal, and a lot of Marty's work brings that out. Now, this is an intellectual contribution. Has it had a real-world impact? You bet it has. In the UK, citing Marty's work, they have a declining discount or time profile for discount rates based on the time horizon, starting at about 3.5%, and then going down over, by 200 years out, it's 2%. Other countries have also now established a declining interest rate profile. Those include France, Norway, Denmark, and without exception, these ministries refer to Marty's work as the intellectual basis for their using these declining interest rate, discount rate profiles. Other countries like Sweden and the Netherlands are considering doing the same. Now, of course, you must be asking, what are we doing in the US? Well, in fact, they haven't adopted the declining discount rate profile, although a National Academy study that several people in this room, including Maureen, Richard, Michael, were you on it as well? Okay. Maybe Bill? Okay. Anyway, I'll stop guessing. They have endorsed, in the context of climate change, a declining discount rate profile. So it's had, in other countries, some real application as well. And it's important. It really affects decisions as to how much we should invest in infrastructure, in mitigation, and in other things. Let me close with one final comment, which is, we're here to celebrate perhaps primarily Marty's intellectual contributions, the substantive contributions. But as Richard already intimated, the style, the nature, the writing itself is wonderful. It's engaging. It often is introspective. It's often in the first person. Yeah. It often makes a hypothesis and then says, well, wait, maybe I'm wrong about this. And it takes you on a journey. It's wonderful writing. So different from a lot of the technocratic writing that we see these days. So I thought it's at least worth acknowledging that the contribution has an aesthetic aspect as well as a purely intellectual one. Thank you, Marty.
Thank you. I certainly don't want to politicize the proceedings, but since you mentioned the current U.S. administration has not adopted declining discount rates over time, we should acknowledge, since it was brought up in Bill Nordhaus's presentation, the calculation of the social cost of carbon, that they've increased the discount rate used therein from 3% to 7%, which has a profound, as you can imagine, a profound effect. So now we're moving back to the East Coast, from the West Coast to back here to Cambridge, MIT Sloan School of Management, where Bob Pindyke has been on the faculty for at least as long as I remember, even though he's a very young man. Bob, you're very familiar with Marty Weitzman's work that we heard about from Bill Nordhaus about fat-tailed distributions, and in fact, you've contributed to that literature. So tell us your insights.
All right, so I'll talk about Marty's work on fat-tailed distributions. Bill spoke about that. What I want to do is just clarify a few things about the nature of Marty's contributions in this area and the implications of fat tails, and then I want to explain to you where I disagree with Marty. There's certain things where we have different views on this, and then where I agree. So first, on the fat tail distributions. What is a fat tail distribution? It's a probability distribution where it can be defined in different ways. The most common definition is a distribution where the tails decline towards zero more slowly than exponentially. Another definition relates to the moments, where only the first two moments exist. Higher order moments don't exist. These, by the way, one can determine the other. And they're not necessarily esoteric, these distributions. So a student T distribution that I'm sure most of you are familiar with is fat-tailed. A Frechet distribution, it's a type of extreme value distribution, is fat-tailed. A Pareto distribution is very nice because it can have fat tails. Depending on the Pareto parameter, it can have very fat tails so that only the first moment exists, moderately fat tails so that maybe 5 or 8 moments exist, or somewhat fat tails so that maybe 20 moments exist. So those are all examples of fat tail distributions. Now, how did Marty get into this? So the first paper that I know about, and I always find out every time I come to something Marty wrote, and I think that's the first thing he did on this topic, then later I learned he did something earlier. But this is what I'm aware of, and then Marty can correct me. It really wasn't the Review of Economic Statistics paper in 2009 that most of you are aware of on modeling the economics of catastrophic climate change. The earlier paper was 2007 in the American Economic Review called Subjective Expectations and Asset Return Puzzles. And what Marty did is he addressed the problem, very, very important problem, called the equity premium puzzle. The equity premium puzzle refers to the fact that if you look at the equity premium in the United States or any developed country, this is the expected return on the stock market minus the return on treasury bills, a safe asset. It's on the order of 6%, something like that. If you take that number, and you take the risk-free rate of about 2%, and you take the volatility of the stock market, things don't work out. it just doesn't jive with any model of investor behavior, unless you assume that investors have a crazy amount of risk aversion, so much risk aversion they would never get up in the morning and get out of bed. So that's the puzzle. And what Marty showed is that let's suppose we have a nice normal economy where the risky asset, equity, has a distribution that's log normal, so that the log of returns is normally distributed. That's thin-tailed. But suppose that the parameters of the distribution, take the variance, for example, we don't know what it is. We have a distribution for that parameter. Well, that can give you a fat-tailed distribution for the returns, and that, in turn, can explain the puzzle. That will give you a solution to the equity premium puzzle. It was an amazing paper in 2007. Not really environmental economics, but a very, very important paper. Then we turn to environmental economics, climate change, and we apply this to the climate change problem. So to make this simple, let's suppose that the variable that we're unsure about, the thing we're studying, is what the increase in the global mean temperature will be 50 years from now, all right? How much will the average temperature on the Earth increase over 50 years if we don't do anything with business as usual, all right? And what Marty showed is that the distribution for that temperature increase, once again, if you don't know the parameters and you have expectations about the parameters, a distribution of the parameters, that distribution could be fat-tailed, right? And if the social welfare function happens to be, let's say, a power utility, constant relative risk aversion, something like that, so that the marginal utility of a reduction in GDP caused by warming goes to infinity as consumption goes to zero, then what happens is that you should be willing to spend 100% of GDP on reducing emissions. That's a pretty big order. So this is where we start to diverge a little bit. But Marty's conclusion is that, look, with fat tails, bad things can happen. And there's no denying that. That's kind of what fat tails implies. So now let me tell you where I disagree and then where I agree with Marty. So let's suppose that the distribution for the global mean temperature 50 years from now has a uniform distribution between 0 and 12 degrees Celsius, all right? So the mean is 6 degrees, and there's a 25% chance of an increase in temperature between 9 degrees and 12 degrees Celsius. I think that'd be pretty bad. I mean, if we had a temperature increase that big, it would be really, really bad. That would be certainly catastrophic. There's no question. But a uniform distribution is thin-tailed. I mean, the tail is 0 after 12 degrees. So the point here is that you don't really need fat tails to come to the conclusion that there is a reasonable probability, some probability, that we will have a catastrophic outcome when it comes to climate change. And that's where Marty and I agree. So Marty has written about looking at climate change as essentially insurance, buying insurance against the chance, the possibility that we'll have a catastrophic outcome. And whether that catastrophic outcome is generated by a fat tail distribution, could be generated by any distribution you happen to pick, you like. The issue is, what is the chance? What is the probability that 30, 40, 50 or longer, years from now longer, we will have an outcome that is truly catastrophic? If that probability is significant, 5%, 8%, 10%, whatever, then we ought to be doing something. Then we ought to be worried. That's kind of the bottom line of it. To me, the bottom line of the Review of Economics and Statistics paper, and the bottom line of what we learned from these fat-tailed analyses. We ought to be worried about catastrophic outcomes. What we need to do is focus on what are the chances of a catastrophic outcome and how catastrophic would it be. And Marty and I think, he'll correct me if I'm wrong, are in a complete agreement about that. So let me stop.
So thank you very much, Bob. So now you've added to Marty's talking points for when he comes up to respond. We started out with Richard Newell talking about Marty's seminal paper in terms of the theory of a paper of prices versus quantities. That paper obviously has implications today for thinking about two frequently discussed policy instruments, carbon taxes and carbon cap and trade. But beyond that, Marty's work as a theorist has had other implications for public policy. We're going to turn now to Jim Stock, who not only is an economist, an important economist in the economics department at Harvard, but also very recently has had some relevant policy experience because he spent time at the Council of Economic Advisors, where in fact those very issues were coming up. Jim.
Okay, so thanks very much. It's a pleasure to be here, and it's I have to say it's just been terrific, or it is terrific, to have Marty as a colleague. I do not want to use the past tense because that better not happen, but it is great having him around and having his ideas and having his inspiration, and it's a real privilege to be able to talk here. I guess, so I was asked to talk about policy, Marty and policy, and you know, Marty's not the sort of, I have a lot of colleagues that you might meet on the 7 a.m. flight to Washington, and Marty's not one of them. But he has had, his ideas have had tremendous influence. So I'd like to talk about three areas in which this influence has really been notable. One of them, actually, I think that Larry did a terrific job, which is talking about the importance of uncertainty and how we think about discount rates and declining discount factors and how that can arise from uncertainty about outcomes in the future. So that's clearly had a big impact. I think Larry listed many countries. It provides an intellectual foundation for thinking about current challenges today with a 7% discount rate that's being used, 7% discount rate that's being used for evaluating the social cost of carbon and being used more generally for discounting under this administration. So that's clearly one of them. I'm not going to belabor that since Larry did a nice job on that. I want to say a little bit more about prices and quantities. And you know, the prices and quantities paper is just it's just amazing. It's really prescient in a number of different ways. So I guess my takeaway from it is that this is like a really lowbrow. The theorists are going to argue with this. I basically say, well, my basically interpretation is that if price fluctuations are not particularly costly, but quantity fluctuations are, then quantity regulation is a good approach. And if quantity fluctuations are not particularly costly, but price fluctuations are, then price regulation is a good approach. And the thing is, what matters there is uncertainty. And I think that what we've seen in the real world is that uncertainty driving fluctuations in prices or quantities, depending upon how the regulation is set up, plays absolutely, to my mind, the first order role in thinking about whether or not one wants to have a quantity regulation or a price regulation. So I think, sort of, if we think about just examples, think about the Regional Greenhouse Gas Initiative that we have here that we're a member of in Massachusetts, and think about how that's actually set up. So how that's set up is that there was an initial meeting where they said, well, what's sort of a price that kind of makes sense that we'd want to pay for it, but then it's implemented in a quantity way. So what happened was the price went way down because a couple of coal plants were closed and because the economy went into a recession. And then they went back and they revisited this and they said, well, gosh, we didn't really have a price of the floor in mind. We had something more meaningful in mind, so they reset the price, but actually what they did is they reset the quantity, and then it actually went way down when a coal plant was closed. So you've got these problems in terms of the actual implementation of these that are associated with this fundamental insight and the importance of price versus quantities. Now, maybe that's not a great example because you could probably argue that this is such a small policy that it's not super costly one way or the other, but there are other places in which there's really big costs, and especially political economy costs. And here I'm thinking of a few people in the room will know my favorite topic, which is the renewable fuel standard, which is a quantity regulation, but it's resulted in highly volatile prices, which has turned this into such a political economy hot potato that the president is off giving speeches. Not just this president, every president is off giving speeches about ethanol in Iowa. Every congressman, every senator is giving speeches about ethanol in Iowa because of the messed up way in which this regulation has been implemented as a quantity regulation, not a price regulation. You kind of wish they'd all gone back and read Marty's paper and kind of thought about it a little bit more when they implemented this. Let me say another word also about the dismal theorem and fat tails. You know, I guess I'm going to, so, you know, it's true the 2009 paper is really hard to understand because it's 0 times infinity is equal to infinity some of the time and it's equal to 0 some of the time. And so but I don't think that's what that paper is about. That's the metaphor, so I'm going to go out on a limb, Marty can disagree. I don't think that's what that paper is about. I think what that paper is about is saying that really there's that these relatively low probability events that have really bad outcomes is what we got to keep our eye on the ball about, and especially in the climate change world. And so in his book with Guerno, they don't do this 0 times infinity thing at all. They just say what's the probability. They do a very specific calculation, which is conditional on 700 ppm. What's the probability of 6 degrees warming using a distribution of the equilibrium climate sensitivity, 6 degrees C. And they say that's big enough that that's going to be a catastrophe, and so we need to pay attention to that. That's 11% in the calculation in their book, and that's what they view as a climate catastrophe. That is really easy to communicate. Everybody gets it. And all of a sudden, all of this stuff, you know, like that National Academy of Sciences report in 2013, where they say reasonable, low likelihood event this century of the West Antarctic ice sheet detaching and melting. And so you read that and it all sounds scary, but you don't know what to do with it. Now you know what to do with it, which is we can start thinking about these really severe outcomes as economists and realizing that those are the reasons that we need to be taking action, or those are key reasons why we need to be taking action now. You heard that rhetoric, or you heard that theme coming out in this most recent release of the IPCC 1.5 report, and in fact, this was the framing that President Obama used in August 2015 when he was rolling out the final rule for the Clean Power Plan, which is we need to take action now because he was more eloquent than this, but some really bad stuff can happen, and we need to take those actions now that are going to make sure that it doesn't. So this has been tremendously influential work, even though he's not there on the 7 a.m. shuttle. You know, one thing I would also like to just mention is that what's terrific. It's terrific having had the opportunity to go over and look at his body of work in anticipation of this panel, because something that comes out through that work, which very much comes out in conversations with Marty, is that he's sort of constantly reminding you, let's keep our eye on the ball. You know, it's fun working out 0 times infinity, and it's fun working out declining discount rates, but in the end, what we're talking about is that we've got some really serious problems, and we need to decarbonize the economy, and we need to pay attention to that and not get too boiled up with the problem of, like, how are we going to get that next pub in the AER? And I want to read something that he wrote in chapter 1. This is a book for the general public, but he's writing this to the economists. He said, so instead of shouting carbon tax or carbon cap, economists ought to work constructively with what we have, second, third, and fourth best solutions, and worse, that create all sorts of inefficiencies, unintended consequences, and other problems, but that roll with the punches of a highly imperfect policy world and may even remove some existing imperfect policy barriers at the same time. He goes on to write about they go on to write about CAFE. Tightened CAFE standards were likely the one new rule from President Obama's first term with the single biggest climate impact. Opinions differ on how cost-effective CAFE standards are. What's clear is that raising CAFE standards is possible to do. Well, I mean, that it was. Yeah, whatever. Though increasing the gas tax is theoretically the first best policy solution. Once again, it would behoove economists to engage in cafe policy debates much beyond the level of shouting gas tax every chance they get. And you know, that sense that we've got a problem, we need to harness our tools, we need to do the best we can as economists to solve these efficiently, is, I think that's just tremendous, and it's something, if we talk about graduate students, what lessons you could take, I think that's a big lesson.
Thank you, Jim. And a shout out to Gernot Wagner, who is with us, who's the co-author of Climate Shock of the book. So we're now going to make an abrupt departure from having thought about climate change policy and the like, because we wanted to cover the incredible diversity of Marty's contributions. And I bet most of you in the room are not aware of the fact that he's done research and interesting writing on fisheries management. In fact, as I recall, you went to Iceland at least once, maybe twice, for that purpose. And Maureen Cropper from the University of Maryland and long time at the World Bank and at Resources for the Future as well, has kindly agreed to take on this topic because each of us, I think, on the panel probably learned by perhaps reading or rereading a paper, but this was new for Maureen, as it would be probably for anyone on the panel. So at least you've learned a lot. So please.
Well, Evans, first of all, I'm really honored to be here, and it isn't surprising that Marty's made a contribution to fisheries economics, given that he's made contributions to almost every other part of economics. And as Rob was just saying, I think this got started around the year 2000 when you were contacted by colleagues in Iceland, a country where fisheries really matter. They're about fishery-related industries, about 25% of GDP, and where they had regulated fisheries like since the mid-'80s by giving out these transferable quotas, the ITQs, individual transferable quotas. And by 2000, there were some fishermen in, the people who held these quotas, let's say, in Iceland who were very rich. And I think that from an equity perspective, people in Iceland were concerned about possibly taxing away these rents and using landing fees to regulate the fishery instead of using ITQs. So they approached Marty, and of course Marty wasn't interested particularly in the equity aspects of redistributing these rents, but he was interested in the efficiency aspects of prices, of using landing fees as a way of regulating the fishery. So, if you look at a standard fisheries model, prices and quantities as a way of regulating in a standard fisheries model where everything's certain, they're equivalent. But they're not under uncertainty. And the type of uncertainty that Marty focused on here is very different from what Richard discussed in terms of the seminal article. The idea here was if you, let's say, know how many fish there are in the fishery at the end of this fishing season, you're going to be still really uncertain about how many fish there will be at the beginning of the next season, which is what fisheries people call recruitment. How fecund the fish are will depend on food supply, it will depend on temperature, it will depend on things, quite frankly, that are uncertain. And so the real source of, a big source of uncertainty to fisheries managers is really the size of recruitment, how big the fish stock will be at the beginning of the next period. So Marty built a model where there were independently and identically distributed shocks to recruitment each period, and he allowed, as we normally do in fisheries models, the marginal profit that fishermen get from fishing to decline as the stock declines. As the stock declines, fish are harder to find, marginal profits are going to decline. So Marty built this model, and then he asked the question, let's suppose the regulator has got to decide whether to impose a quota or a landing fee. But they've got to do this before the uncertainty about how many fish were born, so to speak, has been resolved. They've got to set the policy in this second best situation. And so what Marty shows in this article is actually that the price instrument, the landing fee, can attain the first best solution. The solution that the regulator would actually choose if, in fact, he could actually observe how many new fish there were at the beginning of the next period. Okay, so how can this be? What drives this result? So this is a model where the optimal solution for managing the fishery is, at the end of each period, to achieve a stock, let's call it S star, and it's a bang-bang solution to this problem. We want to get to this stock S star. And so you can see the problem with having to set a quota. If you set the quota and you don't know what the size of recruitment is, the quota is going to equal recruitment minus S star, but you got to set the quota before you know what recruitment is, so you're going to get it wrong. You're going to have to base it on your expectation. But suppose you know the marginal profit function for fishing, and suppose you evaluate that at S star, and that's the tax that you're going to set on fish. So here the fishermen start to fish. It doesn't matter how many new fish are born at the beginning of the period. They're going to keep on fishing, and their marginal profits are going to decline as the fish stock goes down, and they're going to stop fishing where their marginal profits equal the tax, which is going to be at S star, this optimal solution that you're trying to achieve. So given this type of uncertainty, indeed the price instrument is superior. Now, of course, you got to know the marginal profit function. The regulator needs to know this in order to set the tax right. So it raises the question, suppose you didn't know this, which puts you in the world of the seminal article that Richard was mentioning. If you don't really know what the marginal profit function is, then you do, as Marty actually discusses at the end of the article, you have to take that form of uncertainty into account in setting the optimal price. One thing I did, because this was an area that was new to me, was to talk to fisheries economists to ask if there are fisheries where landing fees are actually used to regulate the fishery, and I was informed they're not used. Well, the thing is, let's face it. I mean, if you're a fisherman, you want to get a free quota, transferable quota. You don't want to be having to pay a tax. So the fact that in practice Marty's result hasn't, shall we say, been applied, I think we can attribute to the political economy of fisheries and not to Marty's result. But as I said, I learned a lot by being asked to tackle this topic. And again, it's another example of the use of a simple model and treatment of uncertainty that really actually did start a conversation among fisheries economists when it came out.
Now, my rough estimate, based upon the proportions in the economics profession, is that at least 75% of the economists in the room are empiricists, not theorists. And so what we wanted to take time to reflect on is the importance of the best theory for sound empirical analysis. And I don't think there's any better empiricist working in environmental economics than Michael Greenstone from the University of Chicago. So Michael, you're going to top off the panel by reflecting on that topic.
Terrific. Thanks, and it's a great honor to be here to celebrate Marty. So actually, when Rob asked me, for the very reasons he mentioned, I was a little surprised. Was I really the right voice to comment on Martin Weitzman's incredible theoretical insights? And I then kind of pondered that for a little while. And I came up with a list of explanations, most of which I rejected. But I'll start with, I went and looked up, it's not maybe very well known, but Marty does have an empirical paper.
Yeah.
It's with Andrew Metrick. It's in the Journal of Land Economics. And from that I learned that mammals and birds are more likely to be listed as endangered species than amphibians. I also learned that less money is spent protecting reptiles and mammals. There's a regression, there's standard errors. Looks roughly on the up and up. So maybe that's why. Another possible explanation is we both went to Swarthmore College, which I've always thought was a nice connection. We both taught at MIT at one point, although we weren't colleagues. I'd always hoped at some point we'd be colleagues. I kept searching for reasons. Oh, one other reason, this 2009 paper has come up several times in the Restat. I don't know if anyone remembers that period in Marty's life, but he was extraordinarily passionate about that paper, as he often is about his papers. And I was taken with it with some confusion that Bill described, and solicited it as an assistant editor or associate editor at the Restat. And for all of you who know Marty, I just want you to imagine me trying to guide Marty to change the paper in even small ways, and the correspondence that went back and forth. And so I wondered if Rob knew about that, and this was an opportunity for payback. But I think ultimately, the reason that I'm so happy to be here is that Marty's work is really kind of, it's like the very best theory work, be it the Prices and Quantities paper, the 2009 paper. You take something you're kind of confused about, and then after you read it, you can't understand how in the world you were confused beforehand. It just clarifies things in a way that is really beautiful. And as Bill stole my thunder a little bit, also the green accounting, there's plenty of people in this room, certainly including myself, whose careers you could think of as in one way or another trying to fill in the details that Marty laid out. And so I'm just proud to be here to say that I, among many other people in the room, are standing on your shoulders, Marty, and it's a pleasure to be here to celebrate you.
So please join me in welcoming Marty Weitzman to come up here and join us. So Marty, now's the opportunity for you to respond. It could be both to Bill Nordhaus's keynote and to anything you've heard here. We're eager to hear from you.
Okay. I prepared a brief statement and that I want to read, and then I'll turn to reacting to some comments.
Can you hold the mic? No, thank you.
Am I audible? Okay. I thought I might lighten things up by starting off with a few good jokes appropriate to the occasion. But then I realized that I don't actually know any good jokes appropriate to the occasion. Instead, I'll make a few brief remarks. I'm humbled and honored by this occasion. Sincere gratitude to each of you in the audience for attending this symposium. Many, many thanks. Special thanks to the panelists, some of whom traveled long distances to be here. I am enlightened by your remarks, and I salute you all. Special thanks to Rob Stavins and his team for arranging this symposium and doing the considerable logistic work to make it happen. Special thanks to Bill Nordhaus, the world's leading economist of climate change, for agreeing to be the keynote speaker. And sincere congratulations to him on his well-deserved Nobel Prize. Bill and I go back a long way. As he mentioned, both of us were PhD candidates in the remarkable MIT class of 1967. Other members of our class included George Akerlof, Robert Gordon, Robert Hall, and Joseph Stiglitz. Both Bill and I were assistant and then associate professors for the 5 years after graduation that we spent together at Yale. So we got to know each other pretty well at an impressionable age. We learned a lot from each other in the process and kept up with each other's work subsequently. I think that over the years I've learned more from Bill's work than he from mine, but who's counting? Let me turn to posing and trying to answer a personal question, which I hope is relevant to this occasion. Why do I so much like and am drawn to environmental economics, especially the economics of climate change? Aside from a significant, long-standing general interest in this subject, which has always been there and has always been strong, For me, a large part of the draw is because so many core issues involve conceptual modeling challenges, which I love. There are basic unsettled questions about what are the appropriate frameworks for analyzing the economics of climate change. There is lots of room for creativity on the conceptual side, which typically gives rise to controversy, which is itself stimulating. There are no, or at least few, decisive final answers in conceptualizing the economics of climate change, only partial answers. Examples include intergenerational cost-benefit analysis of climate change, treatment of uncertainty, especially subjective structural uncertainty, best instruments for controlling pollution, very long-run discounting, green accounting, economics of biodiversity, economics of catastrophes, economics of geoengineering, social choice for regulating greenhouse gas emissions, and so forth. This is why I love environmental economics, and especially the economics of climate change. I have tried to chip away at modeling various conceptualizations, but I am well aware that only the surface has been scratched and other interpretations are possible. In conclusion, again, enormous thanks to all of you in the audience for bearing witness today. I can't say enough about my gratitude, and that is about all I have to say formally. Now, for the informal discussion, I want to try to make a few reactions. To Bob Pindyke and his example of the uniform distribution between 0 and 12, I'm not in a lot of sympathy with that kind of an example. Let's make it even simpler. Let's make it a 2-point distribution. So either with a 50% probability, the temperature change will be 2 degrees centigrade, and with a 50% probability, the temperature change will be 10 degrees centigrade. Well, that's really alarming. And look, there's no fat tail there, because after 10 degrees, everything drops down to 0. So I'm not much taken by that example. Yes, it scores a technical point that you can get this kind of thing without the tail dropping to 0. But what I had in mind, and what I think is a fair level playing field here, is to work with a continuous distribution. The model I always had in mind, and which first gave rise to this series of insights, some of which went over to equity premium puzzles, others went over to the dismal theorem and so forth. The first, what alerted me that there's something really interesting going on was this. Suppose you took a normal distribution of something, of anything, of climate sensitivity. Then you, for these equity premium, you get an equity premium puzzle, and everything is well defined for trying to play various games with climate sensitivity and things like it. Suppose, though, we know it's a normal distribution, which is a very thin-tailed distribution. The probability goes very rapidly to 0 of 3 or 4 standard deviations. It's effectively 0 after 4 standard deviations. So it's a very thin-tailed distribution. Suppose we say we don't know the parameters of this distribution. What happens then? Well, I probably was following in many footsteps when the normal distribution is a 2-parameter distribution characterized by its mean and standard deviation. That characterizes it completely. If you change the mean or give it a distribution, nothing explosive happens. It changes answers, but not explosively. If you change the standard deviation and give it a distribution, not just a distribution, but the distribution that in Bayesian terms stands behind the student t taking over for the normal distribution, all hell breaks loose. You've got infinities all over the place. when it came to, and it's in the direction of undoing 3 equity premium type puzzles. It's going in the right direction. It gets infinities, of course. It's going in the right direction to undo the equity premium puzzle. Instead, what you get here is that the equity premium, if you actually take all the integrals, goes to minus infinity. Now, you've got to cut this stuff off at some point to make sense. Also, there was there's a risk-free rate puzzle, that the risk-free rate is too low. Now the risk-free rate becomes infinity. And what was the other one? I can't remember, but it was also reversing that one. So I wasn't pinning down the exact quantitative magnitude of each of these things, but allowing for uncertainty in the standard way for the variance or the standard deviation caused these explosions. And that I could see generalized. It generalized for any continuous distribution where you had it of the form x minus mu over sigma is some standard smooth distribution. It generalized to that kind of thing, of which the normal is a special case. So I don't know where this leaves us. Certainly in the case of the normal, going over to a student t, a very thin-tailed distribution going over to a very fat-tailed distribution, this works, and it works for a generalization of that class. Bob's right. With this 2-point distribution and a 50% chance of 10 degrees centigrade, my simplification of this simple example, it has a very thin tail because nothing happens after 10 degrees centigrade, but I don't think that's the relevant way to look at it. And we can differ on that. As for Bill's critique of the dismal theorem and climate sensitivity, we've never come to a meeting of minds on this. Let me try to explain just a little bit more. Bill doesn't like, for one thing, there's several things he doesn't like. if I can get inside his skin. He doesn't like using climate sensitivity. Isn't that right? Yeah. Well, I don't quite see anything wrong with that. Climate sensitivity is a poster child single statistic that's telling you what is the temperature response to a doubling, the long-run equilibrium temperature response to a doubling of carbon dioxide. Now, that's a useful thing, if you want to summarize and talk to a general audience, that's a useful thing to have in mind. I don't want to go right away to a 14-sector dynamic model. I want to sort of give some sense of the lay of the land. It's imperfect for several reasons. One is that for this climate sensitivity, it's an asymptote. And the bigger is the temperature increase for climate sensitivity, the bigger is the temperature increase, the longer it takes to get there. So you're going to be involved in a battle between discounting and a possibly fat tail in something like that. And I'm just throwing away the discounting side in that, which is admittedly flawed. On this dismal theorem, I tried to back and fill in the original paper. Of course, this is a very simple, and I stated it there, it's very easy to pick on this. It gets you these answers of plus infinity and minus infinity and so forth. I think the truth in it is that if you take a standard sort of model of uncertainty, even with log normal, a log normal distribution is either a fat tail distribution is essentially polynomial. A thin tail distribution, so the tail is going to zero polynomially. A thin-tailed distribution is exponentially or faster. If you take even these examples, for example, that we made with Gernot, we chose a log-normal distribution. Now, a log-normal distribution is not stacking the deck. It's neither fat-tailed nor thin-tailed, or it's both thin-tailed and fat-tailed, depending upon your technical distribution. And we're still getting that at something like 700 parts per million of carbon dioxide equivalent, which is what the International Energy Agency projects for what it's worth, as where we're finally going to stabilize carbon dioxide. You get from just simple climate sensitivity exercise that the probability of an eventual temperature change greater than 6 degrees centigrade is about 10%. So, of course, this dismal theorem of everything blowing up has got to be, it's not true. It's sort of like the value, the statistical value of a human life is not infinity. So something cuts it off. Maybe lots of things cut it off. But the point remains that somehow there is this awkward sensitivity to where you are cutting it off that should make us nervous, or it makes me nervous. Somehow the answers that you get are hanging on where you cut off that distribution. So that's my best take at trying to explain to you what this is about. It cannot be taken literally, obviously. Obviously, it cannot be taken literally. There are many ways out of this. You could say the utility function is not of the standard kind when it gets to low values. You could put in, and I did this, the statistical value of a life as a lower cutoff. There's various gimmicks, but there remains this awkward sensitivity to where you're cutting it off. And I think that's the, if there's any profundity here, that's the profound message, that we're made uneasy, that when we take simple examples like the normal where we don't know the parameters, if you take simple examples, you will get that the probability distribution is not going to zero fast enough to zap out the big damages that are occurring. I think that remains. It's got this awkward aspect that I can only close the model by waving my hands at where the cutoff is. That's admitted, but it still leaves me uneasy, and I think that's the central insight, if there is one, that it still leaves me uneasy that we're so sensitive to that and how it's done. It still leaves me uneasy that with very simple models, we can fairly easily get very high values of the social cost of carbon when you take account of these tails. Where it finally ends up with, I don't know. It ends up being, I guess, an empirical question, but to my mind, and this was another, if you want to call it insight, it's extraordinary, the behavior of the extreme tails is extraordinarily important. It's not the median values that are going to kill us. It's these upper extremities, like what I mentioned, the 10% probability of a 6 degrees centigrade change for 700 parts per million. I guess I will end it there. I think there's a lasting message in all of that, even though it gets mucked up by this cutting off of tails and the fact that you get infinity. I shouldn't have called it the dismal theorem. What I should have called the dismal theorem, what I would now like to call the dismal theorem, would have been that We desperately need more information about what's going on in these tails. But the dismal conclusion is that how the hell can we figure out what's going on in the tails? We only have information to the extent that we have it about the middle of the distribution. All right.
Thank you, Marty. And now we have time for questions from all of you. You can see there are 2 microphones set up at either side of the room. If you do ask a question, if we have any questions, if you do ask one, we'd ask that you start with your name and your affiliation, and you could direct the question to some specific individual who's up here, or you could just put it out in general. And then I guess what I'd finally note is that the way we define a question for these purposes is that it's brief and it ends in a question mark. So do we have, maybe we're not going to have any questions, in which case I have one. Namely, I want to ask any, oops, we do. Please, yes, you, yes.
Is that okay? You can go ahead and ask yours first if you'd like.
No, please.
Okay, Kathy Segerson from the University of Connecticut. So I have a question for both Marty and for Bill, and it has to do with green accounting and national accounts that incorporate pollution. And in particular, how one treats local versus global pollutants. And just to make it more concrete, Rob, you mentioned the fact that the EPA had recently changed the discount rate that they use, say, in the benefit cost analysis for the for the Clean Power Plan. And the other thing they did was to change how they define the social cost of carbon in terms of whether it includes only domestic impacts or includes international ones as well. And I think the arguments for what to do in a benefit cost analysis are pretty clear with regard to that. But my question is, in a national income account, because those are by definition national accounts, how does one differentiate, if at all, between whether the pollutant is local or global? And is there a difference in the social cost of carbon that you would use to reflect that?
So in it's a great question. So in the national income accounts, if one were going to green them, would it be appropriate to include damages that take place outside of the United States or only damages that take place inside the United States? Marty and or Bill, or anyone else for that matter.
Well, it's my party, so I can go first. You're quite right that the difference between... You're quite right that the essential difference between the Obama EPA estimates of the social cost of carbon wasn't just the EPA. It was lots of other government institutions, and our own Michael Greenstone here headed the coordination and the putting together of this social cost of carbon. It made 2 assumptions. One was that this should apply not just to the United States, but the damages should apply to the damages from climate change to the whole world. Now that was and is controversial, and you could argue on both sides. I think there's more of a weight of argument on the side of including global, but there are prominent, respectable economists who think that this is going too far away from EPA's mission. EPA has never, or almost never, included effects on other countries. And the difference between the 3% and the 7%, which is profound. I like to use 200 years because it makes the power of compound interest more powerful. And the difference between 3% discounting and 7% discounting in present discounted values is over 1,000-fold difference. So that's why we say that in the economics of climate change, the biggest uncertainty of all is what discount rate you're choosing. You can get any answer by choosing a discount rate between 0% and 7%. Incidentally, in preparing a paper for a general audience, I was wondering, why do we keep coming back to this 3% and 7%? Where did those come from? Well, they come from government documents that say that for cost-benefit analysis, we should be, I don't even remember the exact names of the cost-benefit analysis, we should be using 7%. That's approximately the average rate of return on capital, the return on the stock market in the U.S. But you should also look at 3% or some. Michael, you may know the exact language. So I think that's the underlying reason that this 3% and 7% crop up so often, rather than 2% and 8% or something like that. Bill.
I think, Jim, you're holding a microphone. Is that because you wanted to respond to this?
It happens to be in my hand, but I actually want to say something on the 3%, 7%, which
Sure.
is at Circular A4, OMB Circular A4, and it happens to be, I think those particular numbers were based on analysis for two different things. One is returns to capital, and that's the 7%, and the other is what would you do to discount consumption. And the circular's actually got a very thoughtful discussion of this. One of them is a Ramsey discussion, the other one is a cost of capital concept, and they say that for the Ramsey, for things where you're talking about discounting future consumption flows, then you should probably use the smaller one. Now the numerical value, 3%, came from studies that they had done and others had done in the 1990s. And this was published in 2000. So there's a lot of views in the Fed and other places that those numbers could be re-examined, and that would be an appropriate thing to do.
I just add on the domestic versus international. I think the strongest argument for using the global damages, which was certainly in the front of our mind, was that there's a reaction function, and if you adopt a higher number and/or agree to abate more, that will cause other countries to abate more, which will provide benefits for the U.S. Now, exactly what that reaction function looks like, it's not 100% clear, but that was the reason, not because we care about Nepal per se or Bangladesh, but because they might do something for us.
You also could have argued as simply that if you wanted to come up with the optimal policy in each country, they should be using the global damages, not the local damages.
But then I think you kind of revert into kind of a UN view of the world, and it seemed like that the U.S. government, we were kind of predicting "Make America Great Again."
Yeah, exactly. Exactly. I just want to follow up on Kathy's question with regard to the distinction between global and domestics. There are a lot of arguments in terms of regulatory impact analysis, benefit cost analysis, for using the global number. We've just heard them. But in terms of green accounting, Bill Nordhaus, in terms of green accounting, if you were recommending how it should be done, if the government decided to really do green accounting, would you say to use global damages for climate change, or would you say to use U.S. damages?
Can I just add to that? In the context of the possibility of reaction function.
I think that there's law, there's accounting, and there's politics. And I think we had, in politics, I think is what we were talking about. I'm very close to Michael's view on this, which is the politics, that's to say how we set our policies is one where we want to have a number that is something we could talk to other people with, use in a bargaining framework. It would be very awkward to have $5 when we're arguing for $40 in an international forum. So I view this as part of an ongoing dialogue with people to forge international agreements that we would use a social cost of carbon that we would be comfortable to use, say, for a global regime. Now, for accounting, it's a little more complicated, because if you think of gross domestic or national, or net domestic or national product, you do not include the impact of our policies on others. We don't include, for example, if we give foreign aid, which has tremendous benefits abroad, we don't include that as a part of our national income. So when we thought about this, I remember Dale and I, where's Dale?
He's right here.
Yeah, when we talked about this, there was a concept of international transfers, and so the way I thought of international spillovers is as a negative international transfer. So if it's $40, say $10 domestic and $30 foreign, then you'd have the $10 in the domestic accounts, but you'd have their transfers as memo items in accounts and not part of accounting, but they are part of the broad integrated set of accounts. And so that would be a negative international transfer when you engage in emissions. And you could actually have a set of accounts of these transfers, and it'd be interesting to know who are the big exporters of negative transfers and who are the big importers. But I think you wouldn't want to include that in domestic income or output.
Thanks. We've got two more. Okay, just
very
briefly,
quick, which is
sure.
Going on a line here. So I think that what one would want to include in a national accounting situation is you would want to include the global emission impact on our economy. So it's actually a little bit different than the lens that one would have on the social cost of carbon. But what we're saying is, how is our economy being influenced? It's not being influenced just by our emissions. It's being influenced by global emissions, of which ours are only, 14% or something like that. So it's a different lens on a similar issue, which is that this is a global externality, and I think in both national accounting and social cost of carbon, it tends to point you toward a global rather than a purely domestic number, but for somewhat different reasons.
Great. Let's go to the next question over here, please.
Hello. Hi. My name is Buhari. I'm a dual degree student between the Wharton School of Business and the Harvard Kennedy School. This is my third and final year. My question is to Bill, and I have a second question to the rest of the panel. But to Bill, first and foremost, congratulations. Second, we love your socks. A lot of us have been trying to say that. And third, can you tell us more about the experience of receiving the call from the Nobel Committee? Was there a chance it could have gone to voicemail, or were you actually right beside your phone hoping that it will ring? And the second question to the broader committee is around using sustainable, sources of energy in developing countries. In sub-Saharan Africa, a lot of, cheap sources of carbon fuels are available, like coal, etc. And the economics just don't work for those countries to decide to move to wind and to solar. So what policy recommendations do you have for countries like that may not be willing to switch just yet because the economics don't work out? Thank you.
So we'll start with Bill and then open to the panel.
I like to sleep, so I turn my phone off, and it's as simple as that. So when I wake up and get a call from my daughter saying, "Dad, it's so nice," and I said, "What's that?" So that's the story of that. But I'll tell you. But more important, I think my reaction is that for many of us, and that includes not just people up here, but many of you in the audience who've been working seriously in a disinterested way on environmental issues and many other issues, it's actually nice to have this kind of news and support and validation of the work we've done. It's the news is, some people are depressed, but I think it's just, there's such a barrage of irrelevant, distressing, and destructive news about environment and other things that it's very nice to have this this kind of news. I think the UN, I'm not sure if I heard somebody say moan or groan about the UN, but I think actually it's a very important report, following other very important reports. We may not agree with everything in them, but there are scholars who, for many years now, have done their best to explain tirelessly in so much detail that I don't think anybody's actually read all these reports. What is happening? What are the fingerprints or the footprints? What are the consequences? And in a way that helps validate the science and the people who are working, not just in this room, but in universities and other institutions around the world. So it was a day of sunshine, when we have all the fog around us. That was my reaction to it.
So because of time, I forgot where the questioner is. I'm not going to follow up now. Maybe afterwards someone will chat to you about renewable resources in developing countries, because I see Jim Hammond and Christian Gaulier over there. So Jim?
Yeah, Jim Hammett from Harvard, and I have the great pleasure to be a frequent participant in the seminar that Marty and Rob run. My question is for Marty and for anyone else who wants to weigh in. You talked about the importance of conceptualizing things well, and I want to ask how you conceptualize uncertainty and the statement, for example, the probability of a, 10-degree warming with 700 ppm is around 10%. What does that mean? Whose probability? How do we think about, obviously it's not repeatable games and the like. It's fundamental to how we think about these problems.
Well, on that particular example, and I imagine it may be a prototype, you postulate some probability distribution for something in the background, and then you grind out what is the probability distribution for something in the foreground. And then it's a point of argumentation or dispute, or you have to make your case why you're choosing that first probability distribution to have the characteristics that it has. And it's your responsibility to try to see where the ultimate answers, the ultimate probability distributions make sense or don't make sense. And so you might want to go back and redo the original underlying probability distribution. I hope this doesn't sound too amorphous.
Christian.
Yes, Christian Gollier from the Toulouse School of Economics. So first, I would like to thank Marty. I had great time working with you over the last 2 decades. We fight a lot, but I learn also a lot trying to find a solution to our problems. Second point is about the 3% versus the 7%. I think we cannot solve the problem if we don't realize that we need to use different discount rate for different investment projects with different risk profile. 3% makes sense if we have not too much risk associated to the benefits. And 7% makes sense also if the project has benefits which is highly positively correlated with the growth of the economy. And it's so surprising that over the last 3 or 4 decades, all those countries try to impose a single discount rate. And therefore, we don't know, we have a lot of debate about what should be the level of the discount rate, whether we should use the Ramsey rule, which is basically for risk-free projects, or whether we should add up a risk premium associated to that. And I think we couldn't solve this dilemma without realizing we need to have not one single discount rate, but a discounting system. Thank you.
Any comments from anyone on the panel? So we do have time for another question, please.
Hi, I was a student of Marty's as an undergraduate, and I'm now doing my PhD in economics. I was just curious, Marty, if you were starting your dissertation again, what you would try to solve.
I don't know. I probably would have shortcut if I could see the future, I would have made a shortcut right to environmental economics and filled in some of those decades, because it's really been a prolific area. I don't know. For me, it starts off with the thought that there's something going on here that we need to understand. Like right now, I had the idea, but it's probably going to amount to crumpled paper in a waste paper basket, that somehow in this far distant discounting, it may be my instinct to use a low discount rate, aside from the scientific, is that I have a lot of reverence for the past. I mean, past thousands of years. I read all kinds of stories and books about anthropology and archaeology, and the Greeks and the Roman Empire and Mesopotamia. I love that. And somehow, you see, there's something there. Somehow that biases me more toward thinking, well, 2,000 years from now, we don't want to leave a tremendous mess, just like we wish the Romans didn't, and they didn't leave us a tremendous. But I don't know how to make anything out of that. I don't know whether you want to question whether economists that know anthropology have a lower discount rate for the far distant future, or whether there's some deeper connection. There's something going on there, and that's usually the beginning of some inspiration. Most of the time, of course, it's a waste of time. You just don't get anywhere with two questions that are too ill posed.
Thank you. So what we'd like to do now is to, Marty, if you would come up and join me. There's not going to be anything violent, I assure you. So many of those who are attending today and many who couldn't attend today wanted to tell Marty directly how they feel about him and his work. And so we've assembled a book, which is for you, which is quite heavy, so you'll definitely want to use 2 hands for that. 60 testimonial letters from some of your admirers. Some of those who couldn't be here today, from whom you'll find letters, include Orly Ashenfelter, Greg Mankiw, Billy Pizer, Joe Shapiro, Carrie Smith, Bob Solow, Nick Stern, who says he disagrees with you a lot but learns from you, Cass Sunsteins, and many others. And then I'm going to read from a different letter that I didn't just mention, but also someone who couldn't be here. And he says, when I was an undergraduate in the economics department at MIT seems to be coming up a lot today. When I was an undergraduate in the economics department at MIT, you were a bright and rising young star. Later, as a faculty member, I routinely assigned your papers to my environmental economics students. Your scholarship and your leadership enriched their experiences and mine tremendously. I will never forget when you announced that you were moving on to Harvard. What a blow. But the universe has seen fit to bring us together once again. It is an honor to acknowledge your extraordinary contributions to the field and to thank you for shining a light for all of us. All the best, Larry Bacow, President, Harvard University. So the book that we've just given to Marty does not end with the testimonial letters. It also includes something else, 52 additional pages, which are the seminar schedules from our 52 semesters together in this seminar in environmental economics and policy. Included, I went back, you'll find the first one is fall of 1992. The seminar presenters included, among others, in alphabetical order in that first semester we did together, Bill Nordhaus, Carrie Smith, Bob Solow, myself, Kip Viscusi, and Marty Weitzman. In virtually every one of the 400 seminars, everyone in the room, and a lot of people here have attended or made presentations. In fact, I think almost everyone on the panel, probably everyone on the panel has made a presentation in the seminar series. Not only does the presenter learn from your questions, but all of us in the audience learn from your questions. So that's why we've included every schedule from 1992 until the one culminating in the current semester. I don't say concluding in the current semester because I expect our collaboration to continue. So thank you for everything you've done. I certainly don't want you and Jennifer to not enjoy your free time together, but I implore you and I expect that you will not really retire. You want to say anything?
I can't say any more than I've said before. I'm extremely grateful, humbled. Many thanks to all of you.
So thank you, Marty. The last thing I want to mention is that to thank again the Harvard Environmental Economics Program, the Harvard University Center for the Environment, and the Mossavar-Rahmani Center for Business and Government here at the Harvard Kennedy School. Also, let me ask Rob Stowe, Jason Chapman. Jason, are you? Jason Chapman, Casey Billings, not here, and Scott Leland to stand, not only because they represent those organizations, but because if you have any logistical questions whatsoever, then those are the people to talk to immediately afterwards.